The first thing we're going to start out with is we're going to go a little bit more in depth on a jQuery interview, introduce jQuery to you. Then we're going to show you some typical JavaScript that we're going to be using as an example for how to package JavaScript as a jQuery plugin to make it more portable and reusable. We'll go through and we'll discuss how to work with jQuery plugins. And then we'll actually go through, and Ed will be programming without a net, and we'll be writing a plugin
by creating a little form, a little 4 or 5 field form, and have it populate a table using PHP. Populate a MySQL table that could then be just brought up and indexed and used, and it automates that process. Of course, that becomes a lot more difficult when you start doing it because it's not that simple. You know, anybody can figure out how to do a form tag, but then you got to validate. Then you've got to try to create some of these other features and make sure it works. And doing all that, I came to really appreciate what HTML5 offers versus what we've been doing currently with HTML. And so that's where I want to go with this, so that if you are working on some of the web coding in your library, then hopefully this will show you some of these things that you can use. If you are wanting to go in that direction, like I know
jQuery library available to you. To add in additional plugins, you would just add in another script reference and pull in that plugin. What jQuery brings to you, among other things, is the ability to use selectors. If you're working with CSS at all and you're using CSS selectors to define CSS rules, the basic level of doing jQuery selection will be very familiar to you. And if you're looking up here on the screen, you can see that in this first call, the function that we're using is $, and within function we're passing a string to select all of the divs on a page.
So $sign is the jQuery object. It's a variable reference to jQuery.
A shortcut that jQuery uses by default. Some other libraries also use $, and if you're using those libraries with jQuery, there's an option to use jQuery in no conflict mode. And so instead of using the $, you would use full typed out jQuery and then your function call. So the first example was selecting by element, and we're selecting all the divs. We can also do ID selection or class selection, or even select multiple elements, or start using more complex descendant selectors. All of these are supported natively within jQuery. jQuery also builds upon that and allows you to write your own selectors, and it provides several other advanced selectors. And we'll run through some of those as we go through our demonstration. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use Firebug. We're running Firefox, and Firebug is a very good developer tool that allows you to see behind the scenes of your web page and get access not only to the DOM, but also all of the resources that are brought into the page and interact with them. So I'm going to pull that up, and we're going to run through a couple of examples. I have the option here of drilling down into the HTML, but I'm going to go just to the console. And then we'll walk through building up a selector on this page. So the first thing that I'm going to do, you'll notice that I'm using double quotes here instead of single quotes. Because it's JavaScript, you can substitute those back and forth as appropriate, as long as you're not mixing them within one selection. All of our slides are objects of class slide. So if I select $, parentheses, quote, dot slide, quote, end parentheses, it will return a collection of jQuery objects, and each one of these represents a slide within the presentation. What we can do, though, is I can add on :visible, and now it will return only one. And if I hover over the returned object, you'll see that it's selecting my current slide.
That's one of the jQuery extensions, is the :visible. There's a lot of others.
Yeah. So already, with just one statement, we're able to select the current slide. I can then go ahead and add on to that selector to select within a div on the page the paragraphs on that page. And you'll see that the return object here returned 5 different paragraph objects on the page. So those are now available for me to work with. So the first part of jQuery was the ability to quickly and powerfully select portions of your page that you want to work with. Once you have those selected, you're able to use both built-in methods and plug-in methods to take actions against those selections. In this case, the code that we have here is effectively one line of JavaScript, but we've split it across 4 for readability. We're selecting all of the big divs on the page. Then once we have them selected, we're adding an additional CSS class to those. Then we're using fade-in to show those divs. And then we're appending some text all in one line of code.
And it's getting done to each of the divs that got selected. So if there's 1 or there's 20, all those actions are going to happen to all of them. It's very compact.
So with a very small amount of code that you're writing on the page, you're gaining a lot of functionality out of the library. There are also the ability to take advantage of some really good design practices. Unobtrusive JavaScript is the idea that your JavaScript is completely separate of your HTML, that you're not embedding on click within your tags. Your JavaScript lives separate of your data. And in this example, we're going to the visible slide. We're going to each list element on the page, and we're binding the click function to that element. Within the function there, the keyword this is scoped. And what that's going to do is it's going to represent the particular element that was clicked. So $this.css background color is going to attach a background color to the li element that was clicked. And again, one of the nice features about using Firebug is that I can pull it up and I can paste in the code that I want to run that against the page. You can see that my jQuery return was the 3 objects to allow for additional chaining. But we've attached that click event to those 3 items on the page. So if I click here, I'll get an alert on the page, and you'll see that the background color of that li has changed. And I can do the same thing here, and you'll see that I clicked callbacks, and it changed.
One thing to keep in mind about the this keyword, it can have different meanings depending on where it lives in your code. In this case, it's inside of a callback, in which case jQuery is just giving you each individual DOM element that's being affected. So in this case, like click, like he said, it's the actual DOM element. So you need to wrap it in the jQuery. That's why it's $parens this. There are other places where you don't need to do that, and this just means the jQuery object that was selected. We'll show an example of that later.
Okay. But in addition to the base functionality that comes with the library, you also gain the ability to use all of the plugins that have been written for jQuery and that are shared on their site. If you go to pluginsjQuery.com or jQueryui.com, you'll find a full set of plugins, a directory, and they range from UI elements being added to a page to utility functions to those that will help you when you're working with Ajax and JSON, a lot of different functionality, all using the same basic syntax.
jQuery UI is, sorry to interrupt, kind of like an official almost addition to jQuery. And then some of the other ones will show you, like mini-colors, are just some Joe wrote something and made it available, and it's listed on the jQuery site because they have a large, organized list of jQuery plugins for different functionality.
And one of the other benefits you get with that official set of jQuery UI plugins is you get automatic theming. You'll notice here that the calendar element has a particular style to it. If I have selected that style when I loaded jQuery UI, all of the other plugins, both jQuery UI and other plugins that adhere to the jQuery UI theming standards, will pick up that same color, will use that same set of icons, and I'll have a consistent look to my page. It won't look as though I'm grabbing something from box A, something from box B, and something from box C. They'll all share that common theme, and that saves you a lot of trouble.
Just a really quick question with jQuery.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do you guys use like CSS resets?
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you find that the UI elements for jQuery get really large?
In fact, that's why this is not an actual plugin. That's a JPEG, because I included it on this page, and I was like, I could try and work on this, but they're kind of blown all out of proportion.
They're basing off of the base font size that's defined at the page level. Okay. And so generally I believe that they are M-based. I may be wrong. They may be %-based. If you change that base font size for your page and then restructure your CSS a little bit, they'll both behave at, whether it's page elements or jQuery UI elements, should both behave similarly as the page either scroll, change as you change the zoom size or what have you. So as an example, for mini colors, there's a text box here, and next to it, you may be able to see there's a small swatch that's just white. If I click there, I get the benefit of this user interface element coming up. I can go through and I can select a hue, I can select a color, and you'll see that I'm getting a CSS style color that's in the box. If I tab out of that, my swatch is now colored with that color, and if this was part of a form, that value is ready to send back to the server. So you get a lot of functionality for your page. If you had to write something like that from scratch, it'd be really complex, but the ability to call something like that in is very powerful. We're going to go back. We're going to talk now a little bit about some of the typical JavaScript we had on our website, and we're going to use that as the base example to build on as Ed builds the plugin later in the session. So this is the JavaScript that we're going to be working with. And what we found as we went through was that we had several functions that were separately written that basically did the same thing. And the basic functionality that this represents is for a particular object, locating its parent, finding its sibling of a particular type, and hiding or showing it when the base object is clicked. In this case, the one that's showing, expand paragraph, was working on divs. The one below, for expand subnavs, was working with li elements in a list for our subnavigation. Same basic functionality, but we wrote it twice. It was very verbose in terms of the way we wrote it. And all of the variables that we were using attached to the global variable in JavaScript. And the problem with that is that as you add more JavaScript, you're exposing more and more of your variables in that global object, and the potential for namespace conflicts and unintended interactions between JavaScripts increases. The other problem with writing just straight JavaScript is that you don't gain the benefit of the benefits that jQuery provides in terms of automatically handling cross-browser issues. For instance, if you were writing a function that needed to modify padding, and you wanted it to work with Internet Explorer 6, and you wanted it to work with other browsers, you would have to write additional code. If you're doing the same thing with jQuery, jQuery automatically does browser detection, and it knows that when it's going to interface with any CSS padding issues, that it's going to treat IE6 differently than it would treat other browsers to eliminate the padding issues that IE6 has. So some typical JavaScripts here, and we think we can go ahead and show you some things that are going to be a little bit better in terms of how to provide that same functionality. So typical plugin usage. How do we interact with the plugin when we're calling it from the page? The most basic level of initialization of a plugin is to use a selector to find the element that we want to take action against, and then call the plugin. Most plugins have default behaviors, so it's enough to call them just with an empty set of parentheses. And it will enact the default behavior against that selected element. With many plugins, they'll offer options to allow you to customize how that object is going to behave on your page. In this case, the date picker, we can specify what date format we want it to use, and it will use that date format when it returns the value back to the page. Or we can supply button text, or we can override positioning, or we can override color. A lot of different things that can be done depending on what functionality the plugin exposes. In the case of our presentation today, this is all one web page, and we're using a plugin to take that web page and break up the slides and turn it into a presentation. And so this is the code on lines 8 through 11 that was used to initialize what you see there on the screen.
Except for we used actually the default option. You see the previous and next buttons in the upper right corner. You can rename what those are. And the other key thing about this page, this is a typical way that plugins and indeed the core stuff is written in jQuery. You don't pass in individual parameters and need to remember what order to pass them in. You pass in one single object, and those properties of the object become the things that you're overriding. So you don't need to remember that button text comes before date format in the formal parameter list. You just pass in the whole thing.
Before moving on to the next slide, some of the things we're going to be showing you, we think, represent a best practice, and there is a single identifiable reason for doing a particular portion one way. For the rest of this, it's much more wide open, and we're going to try and show you, in some cases, a couple of different ways, or just discuss that there are many different ways to accomplish that particular functionality within the plugin. So this is a place where we start seeing some different behaviors in terms of how different authors structure their plugins differently. And it's not just on author preference, it's tailoring the plugin to address the needs of how that plugin needs to interact with your code. So in the case of Minicolor is exposing some setter-only functions. You can, with your code, external to the plugin, send commands over to the plugin and change the behavior of the plugin on the page. In this case, Minicolors is allowing us to disable or re-enable its functionality, or to explicitly set a color. For Date Picker has the ability to both get information from the plugin and send information back to the plugin. And that's doing it with selecting an action and then identifying a variable to pass on the setter. Some of the other ones will also take even 3 options or more. It depends on the plugin. You're going to want to look at the documentation for the particular plugin that you're using. Often, they'll give you the option of sending an entire object worth of information to the plugin all in one go.
Similar to the initializer.
Similar, yeah.
So the other key thing on here is to notice they're you could call them methods, like methods of the plugin, but really you're just passing a string, and that string name identifies the method. The actual function that you're writing it's a single point of entry, and that's common across the well-written plugins, where Minicolors, for instance, you always call .minicolors. There's no other method. But when you pass the parameters, that's when you get the different functionalities. So they try not to clutter the jQuery plugin namespace.
And we want to preserve the behavior that the built-in methods of jQuery have and provide the same functionality. So in the same way that you saw the chaining happening before, when we write our plugins, we want to provide that same functionality. And you'll see here that acting on objects of class date, we're using the native before action, and then date picker fits in that chain along with the rest and allows it to pass. Where you have a method that needs to return a value, like on the previous page here of getDate on this line, that's going to break the chain because it needs to return the date object rather than allow the chain to continue. So that's the only exception to where chaining would not continue. You can put that at the end of a chain and act on everything along the chain, and then use that as the return to return back to a value. And the other thing that we want to preserve, but there is an option on, is where possible we want our plugin to work on one or more objects on the page. The exception to that is if you're designing a plugin that's designed to only have one instance on a page. But for everything else, you want your plugin to gracefully handle any selector set that comes in, which could even be an empty set. And then, as you get further into things, you're going to want to allow for rich interaction between the plugin and the code that you're using to call it. If you're interacting with code that needs to asynchronously handle communications with the server using AJAX, you're going to want to be able to accept a callback from the function to let you know when it's received the data, or when it's displayed the data to the screen, or when it's finished, or when the user has triggered off a behavior within the plugin that you need to know about to take action against. So in this case, on input date, it's handling when the date is selected. We're going to take action using information that it's going to pass back to us.
So it's some internal event that happened inside the plugin. The user clicked to select a date, and now you can do some programming based on, right after that happens, here's what I want to do.
Okay. So we're going to move into packaging with jQuery. Before we do that, I'm just going to really quickly flip over and show you the functionality that Ed's going to be providing. We have a frequently asked questions page up here. And rather than having a long list of questions and answers, we want the user, if they have JavaScript running on the browser, to start out with just seeing the questions. And then if they click on any of the questions, we want the arrow to change to point down, and we want to reveal the question. And in this instance, you saw that that was taking advantage of some of the built-in animation. With the actual JavaScript that we showed you earlier, it was just hiding it and showing it and doing it with no animation, so there was no visual cueing for the user. So that's what what Ed's going to be building up to.
So we're going to introduce some new tools, and I'm not going to be writing 100% of the plugin. What I'm going to try and show you as we go through is how to implement all of the basic wrapper stuff in order to make it a plugin. And then when it comes to actually doing the functionality that we had in the JavaScript before, I'm just going to paste that in, because the key thing you're here for is not how to do FAQs, it's how to write plugins. So how do we start? This is typical of all of the plugins that you'll see. You wrap the function that you're writing inside of something called a closure. There's a little bit of kind of magic that's happening on some of these lines, and I'll describe a couple of the things that are going on. The first thing you see, the initial outer function is being defined. That function isn't your plugin code, it creates your plugin code. So this is what runs once. It's getting defined as JavaScript is going through your lines of code. It says, okay, you're defining a function. We haven't given it a name, so we're not doing anything to the global namespace. And when we get to the end, at the bottom line, that's where your close bracket is. Now we start open parens, and that's saying, okay, we defined an anonymous function. Now we're going to execute it. And so what's inside that last line is we're going to execute the function and pass it the value jQuery. jQuery all written out, so that we're avoiding conflict, like I mentioned before, with the $sign. If you have another script loaded that's using that, this is safe. The formal parameter at the top of the list is $. So that's internal to our function. This is not going to conflict with anything on the page because it's just internal. So what we're saying is, give me the JavaScript object, and I'm going to call it $. Internally so that we can use it like we're used to. So that's sort of one piece of the magic. The other piece is what actually creates the closure is this separate inner function. This is the function that's your plugin. Every time someone runs your plugin and says, jQuery.faq something or other, this inner function is what's going to run. And we're making the inner function, which would normally be private, available by adding it to the prototype of the jQuery object, meaning this $.fn is just a synonym for prototype, which in JavaScript says add this to every object of this type. So every jQuery, anyone who uses it can now write $.faq, or in this case, $.myplugin. When you make that inner function available to some for someone to use outside of that outer scope, they continue to have access to variables defined within that first function. So we're defining var counter, but after this code executes, we've created our function that's never going to run again. But when they call your plugin, you can have access internally to that variable. That's sort of the other part of the magic. Douglas Crockford describes this really well. If you search, looks like we went off full screen here. See Crockford's privileged method. If you search on that, he's got a number of good writings on JavaScript. And if you find the page that has privileged method on it, he describes a lot of different ways of doing this sort of stuff. But closure is what does the magic. I'm going to actually go out.
And as Ed's switching over to the editor, and he will increase the font size so that it is readable.
Yes.
This is a book on JavaScript. It's a really well-written book on JavaScript. Notice how thick it is. This is Douglas Crockford's book, JavaScript, The Good Parts. This is a very good book. It covers the core subset of the JavaScript language that he has picked out and has said these are methods, calls, functions that will lend themselves to writing better JavaScript. If you're familiar with the use of the eval method, or eval function in JavaScript, dangerous, open for cross-site scripting, things like that, not over here in this part. And then he went beyond defining that subset of the language, the good parts, and wrote a tool to help enforce that. If any of you have programmed in C and are used to using lint, he wrote JSLint. And JSLint is available online. You can go ahead and you can paste your code into it, or you'll notice that Ed has a plugin here installed within Notepad++ that is going to allow him to run lint interactively within his editor. And so we'll go through, and he's going to be performing lint every now and then as he's writing this. And you'll see it if he happens to make any errors, which I doubt. You'll see those get caught, and then he'll go through and deal with them. We start out with using the good parts button here to select all of the items that he suggests in the book. But then we deviate from the rules a little bit. And in particular, we're allowing the use of plus plus and minus minus. Because we've read his book, we've seen his arguments against using those, and we've decided that we trust ourselves to use those correctly. And Ed had also defined jQuery there so that we wouldn't get warnings that it didn't see jQuery being defined on the page. Because in the scope of what he's writing, we haven't included the larger jQuery library, we're just referencing it. And so by putting that in there, he's telling lint it's okay. Trust me, I'm going to install that later.
Because it'll complain about that. It'll complain about things like syntax error, like I'm making here. I expected a semicolon. If you're really strict about it, it'll complain about white space. It wants a space between function and paren. These are all, again, settable. So we've got the basic wrapper now for any plugin. This is the closure. Your code's going to go in here. Anything you want to have defined once and referenced multiple times when the plugins run goes in the outer scope above the function declaration, the inner one. So we're basically ready now, although, of course, this does nothing.
And in fact, in its current state, that wouldn't have passed on the chain. So the next thing Ed's going to be adding is he's going to be adding chaining.
And this is a single line of code. When you, inside the jQuery plugin that we're defining, this is now referring to the full jQuery matched set, so not the individual DOM elements like we talked about before. So when I return the keyword this, it's just saying, okay, whatever you selected, I'm passing it on, and that's what completes the chain. Sometimes you'll see this in a slightly different format. In fact, often you'll see it if you look at someone's plugin code. They're going to typically, although we won't in our example, they're going to typically iteratively go over whatever you selected. So all the LIs on the page, okay, I'm going to call this function that you passed me once for each of the DOM elements. And that's done with the jQuery each function. So they're saying return this.each function, and then the EL is the element that's getting passed in. In other words, the first LI comes in and you run your code. The second LI comes in and you run your code. And the return of each is, again, the complete matched set. So the chaining continues. So you'll often see it like that. But in our code, we're going to be cheap and just say return this, and of course lint it. Now we do chaining. We still don't do anything, but we allow chaining. So you could insert this into a sequence of chained commands, and this would work just fine. Now, the thing we talked about was how to give default preferences. So when somebody runs your plugin with no options at all, you want it to have some base functionality that's customizable. So what we do here is make use of that magic of closure, define something inside the outer function, which is going to be our defaults. So remember, this gets defined only once when the plugin is defined. And then once people are accessing your code, you can reference that multiple times. If they call it multiple times, you're not redefining the defaults every time.
And this is the same level within the JavaScript, where if you wanted to make private functions available for you to call with any of your other functions, you would insert them at the same level.
All right, so now we have defaults. I'm not doing anything with them yet. The last line on there in the separate throwout is how it looks when you're going to say your function was called tooltip. You just open close paren, and that's how you use the default functionality now. So how do you now override parameters? We've kind of combined, in this example, the object that's the defaults into a one-liner, and then at the end added another variable called settings, which is where we're going to hold the combined settings of starting with the defaults and then adding on whatever you passed in. So remember, people are going to pass in an object, not individual parameters, but one object that has, is keyworded based on, you've hopefully documented what your keywords are, or maybe they have to just look at your code. In this example here, the location is going to be default to top, the background color will be true, and then the magic happens on line 4. There's a jQuery function called .extend, and that says you can pass this any number of objects that you want, and it takes the first object and then clobbers it with the second object or adds to it. And then if you have a third object, it just continues. Okay, now take whatever's in the third object that's different and put it on top of there, and it clobbers that first parameter. So if you said $.extend defaults, comma options, we'd clobber our defaults, and then the next run through, the defaults would be changed. So in this case, we're giving it an empty object, that open close paren. We're saying just create a new object, put the defaults into it, then throw the options on top of that, and it also returns the value that it ends up with. So this first parameter will end up with all the settings, and they return it. So this is how you would do this if you want to keep from clobbering any of your stuff. Defaults will stay the same as it was at the beginning. Options that they pass in will stay the same, and you'll have the combined set as settings.
The other thing you can do with extend, the way we've written it there, takes a look at the top-level objects, with the top-level items within each of those objects, and does a comparison to see if they're there, and if it moves them over. It's not looking multiple levels down with the way it's written there. However, if we put a Boolean true as the first parameter to that call, it will look down. So as you write more complex plugins that have hierarchies to them, you would want to stick a true there so that you can affect something nested deep within with a call and have that handled correctly.
But we have just a simple object for defaults, so this code is going to do just fine.
And why did you add settings up under the first default?
That's declaring it. So if somebody calls your plugin a second time, say they initialize it, and then they call it again for like a getter or a setter, the settings are still there because they're in the outer scope. It remembers.
It could have been scoped internal, and we'll show that as we go through and we talk about data.
Well, remember that every time you call your plugin, not when you define your plugin, but every time you call it, everything in this function is getting executed. So you don't want to redefine necessarily your settings because they want to pass them in once and then use your plugin. That's why it goes in the outer. And then to use it, we've seen this before. Location starts at top, background color starts at blue, and then in the usage, you know what, override location as left. Default color can stay at blue. And then there's another kind of more advanced example that Jason's going to go through. Say you wanted to affect multiple things on your page. They're going to hit all the LIs or all the divs. And maybe you want to allow them to have different settings for each div. So Jason's going to show one example of that.
One of the takeaways that's available for you to have on the session, the CALI session page, is a file that we put together that is a boilerplate for building templates. And I'm going to pull that up and show that to you now. And within this code, we've tried to document what we're doing. We show a different type of jQuery function, a utility function that just attaches directly to the $sign. We show ones that are wrapper functions, which are what we're working with now, that can take a wrapped set of selected objects. And within here, we're addressing some of the things that you were asking about the scope. You'll see that defaults is defined outside of the plugin, but within the plugin, we're defining a data store, and we're defining options options within here. Deeper within, we have a function for getOptions, and getOptions looks to see if on the particular element that we're working with, there was data that was tied to the namespace of our plugin for previously set options. And if there were options that were passed in against that element, or that were attached directly as an attribute to the tag within the HTML of that object, it will use those in the initialization process and then keep those on, as we call, subsequent methods against that element.
You'll see that in like the HTML5 data attributes. This sort of predates that.
But works well with it.
Right.
So in this case, it's taking a look to see if on that element there is already attached data, and then it will use that. If there was not a prior data store, for instance, or if the data store was not undefined, then it uses it. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and build our own data store. So there are two different things that we're doing here in parallel. We're keeping track of the options that the user passed, and we're using data store to keep track of the state of that particular element. And then there's a corresponding set options that's called at the end of our process to store all of those things back to the element on the page. And again, this file will be available for you to download, and we have a more robust set of examples here, and then at the end there are a whole series of things that we've found helpful.
And what's next? Methods, I believe. Okay, so again, method access. This is the one slide, I think, where we showed that there are really lots of different flavors for ways to do this.
And we're going to end up showing you two of them. One of them is the default presentation that jQuery uses in their documentation on how to write plugins. Right. And then we're in the boilerplate file that you can download, we show another one.
And that one's this. I think this one is kind of the simplest one. This is the easiest to read and probably the easiest to deal with. Not a lot of magic happening. So basically, remember, they're going to pass in a string that names the method. And as long as we know about that method, that's one that we defined, then we just test for that string value. So there's a switch statement down at the bottom saying, hey, what action did they ask for? Did they ask for initialize? Then run initialize. Did they ask for color? Then we're going to do a getter or a setter. The one thing extra that happens here is, remember, people can pass in kind of anything to the plugin. They might pass nothing, and we've got to remember that that means initialize. They might pass an object, and that means initialize. So now we're sort of mapping to that action, because we have, in the switch, we say we're looking for the action initialize. So that's what's happening here in this if statement. If they didn't pass in an action, or if they passed in an object, we know they meant initialize. And pull those, the object, even if it's nothing, into the options, so that if they did pass something in, we'll go and override the defaults like we talked about before. But also set the action to initialize, so when you get to the case statement, it does the right thing. So that's one way. I think it's easy to read, it's easy to understand, but you do need to go add, if you're defining like initialize as a separate function maybe somewhere, you need to go add another function the next time you want to change the code, and you need to remember to also add it to the switch statement. So there's two places to do it. The other way to do it, this is again pretty close to what's on the jQuery plugin authoring page. Certainly a lot harder to read, but it's a little more dynamic. So what this does is stores each of the methods in an object. And the object's called methods. It's sitting up here in the outer scope. Methods.init is a function. Here's where I defined it. methods.color is a function, maybe a getter or a setter, maybe both, depending on what parameters you pass in. And it's a function that gets executed. So you can store functions as properties of objects in JavaScript. The magic stuff that happens down here, I'll try to explain. I think we'll go over into, we'll go over into here and start writing it. We're going to add methods as an object. And the properties are, we've got something called init, which is a function that accepts options. And you could add more with something else after here. We're not going to add any more at this time. But basically, that init is really what we started writing down here. So I'm just going to take that code and say, do this. So now we have to add the magic down here, and I'll try to explain the magic. The magic is essentially two branches. One is, did you pass in a method that I know about? In other words, is there a property of the methods object that matches whatever name you passed in? And you can do that like this in JavaScript. If they pass in a string that's recognized, you can use either dot notation, methods.init, or you can search with the square brackets and say, if you provide a string within that, it'll find that property of the object. JavaScript is loosey-goosey.
Powerful enough to shoot yourself in the foot with.
So that first branch is going to be, they picked a method specifically. In other words, they passed in a string that matches something in that object. Otherwise, they may have not. And let's see.
And if they didn't, we're going to want to set up the options to start checking and seeing how we need to provide the initializer directly. And so if they didn't pass a method at all, or if they passed in an object that contains defaults, then we'll go ahead and we'll directly call the method for init.
Remember, this is, again, a loosey-goosey thing. I just changed our parameter, our one formal parameter, from options to method, but they can pass whatever they want. You can pass JavaScript anything. They could pass nothing. They could pass 27 parameters. You're going to get it all inside the JavaScript. It's just, you have to deal with, within here now, what did you call the formal parameter, and what did they actually pass, and does it match or does it not? You have to do some checking. And let's not forget, return this at the end. So here's actually where we differ from the boilerplate that's on the jQuery site. They have a third branch that says, if you passed in a method that doesn't exist, I'm going to throw an error or set a console log. And that might be, you might think of that as really helpful, but in almost every case of a well-written plugin that I've seen, they ignore stuff like that so that you don't break the chain. So like jQuery UI, you pass in a method called peanut butter and jelly sandwich. It's not going to find it, and the chain can continue. I think you actually can pass JavaScript a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. It accepts those, right?
I believe so.
I think it does.
But you want to write your plugin so that it's going to handle things gracefully as possible. If the selector set that is called from the initial thing finds no objects of that type, you should be able to handle being passed nothing and not generate an error. The user may use that as a technique on their page to say, if there are any objects of this particular type, do this action against them, just by doing $selector method. They don't have to write an if statement to do the detection first and then take action against it if it exists. You can write it much more complexly, or much more compactly by just using jQuery and the selector and letting the selector handle there are 0 of these cases.
So I'll try and explain some of the funny business that's going on in this first branch. Remember, methods, bracket method, identifies the function init. If they passed in the word init, this is going to find the function init. And then the magic word in JavaScript, apply, is sort of a dynamic sort of thing, not as evil as eval. But this says basically, if that's a function, run it. And you're going to pass it these parameters. The this is, what do you want the function to act on? And we're going to pass in the jQuery object. And the second parameter for apply is give me an array of parameters to pass. So in this case, this first branch was when they passed the method name as the first parameter. So we're going to slice that off. That's where we do array.prototype. So this is where the slice method in JavaScript lives. We're going to call array prototype slice, and then .call is very similar to apply, but it accepts a single parameter at the end instead of an array of parameters. So the other keyword, there's a lot of magic in this one. Arguments is whatever it was they passed in, the peanut butter and jelly sandwich. I don't care if it's 27 parameters, none. Doesn't matter if it matches the formal parameters. This is the entire array. Take that array, slice off the first one because it's 0-based. We're saying pass in 1 to slice. So it's basically give me everything starting at 1 and after, whether it's nothing or the 27 parameters.
And we're almost finished with this. The part that's missing is we're on the third branch, we're handling the chaining by returning that. When we're calling either of the methods with methods method or methods init, we need to complete the chain. Either way that we get to init has a return this in it. But we're returning this to the call, so we need to return the call back out to complete the chain.
Right. Thank you.
So we're passing off twice in this example what was passed into us in order to get it back to complete the chain.
So hopefully I got all that right.
Well, did you JS-lint it?
I did. But that doesn't do everything for you.
Right. What it will do, though, JS-lint has a default warning that comes with it. JS-lint will hurt your feelings. But if you use it and you follow the patterns that it starts instilling in you, you will end up writing better code. It does give you a subset of that entire set of JavaScript to work within, but you still have all of the functionality you could possibly ask for. It just guides you along a path and gives you warnings. And the trick with any situation like that is to know when to ignore the warnings and when to break the rules. But you,
like use strict in Perl.
Use
yes.
strict,
Yeah.
Exactly. So we've created something here which, again, still does absolutely nothing but define an empty plugin. But these are all the things you need to know. This is where your jumping off point is for, okay, now I want to add my functionality. And you're going to add it to init. You're going to add it as a method that follows init, perhaps. Another, colorize function. You're going to add your stuff here. And I am now going to cheat. We have a pre-written plugin because this isn't really the interesting part. This is just what we wanted to do with the plugin. I'm going to go a couple places. One is that FAQ page that we showed you as a demo. I'm going to try and be a little bit good and...
Actually, we have 11 minutes. So.
Okay, we'll try and be quick.
So we're going to go through. Ed's going to take the code that performs the actions and add that to the wrappers that he's created. And then we'll go ahead and run that and show you that the fact page that we showed you before, he'll switch over to use the new one. And we'll show you that it's still working. But we'll go ahead and show you that we can go back to how we're calling it and change that option at the beginning for show hidden or start hidden, and change it so that everyone starts with everything shown on the page.
Okay, so I added a little documentation. This is what we expect the DOM to look like, but again, we're going to add a few more defaults as well.
And this is another place. We're expecting the DOM to look a particular way, but he's added sections in here so that you can override the classes. The important part on this is that for our page structure, it may be perfectly fine to have a class called .question. You may already be using .question within your, a question class within your CSS, and you don't want to have to restructure the rest of the page just so you can use our plugin. So by exposing those kind of things as settings, you can define that class for yourself throughout all of the plugin just by passing it in once. And instead of using .question, it'll use whatever you've supplied so that we're not enforcing requirements on your page. We're just providing functionality.
And there's one little bit of sort of outside dependency. We created these two CSS classes for the left arrow, down arrow, and those have to live in our CSS file. So we're not entirely, independent of everything else. But I did now change the reference on this FAQ page, and we can prove it with, this is one of the other nice things that Firebug does. I'm refreshing, and now I can see what scripts have loaded, and you see it's faq.js. That's the one we just wrote instead of jQuery.faq.js, which is sort of a common naming convention for plugins. So we've run it. The page is looking okay. Hopefully, the click event works. Yay.
Ta-da!
And Jason did a test to see, hey, I wonder what happens if we nest them. And it happens to work just fine. We didn't need to add anything for that. So then the one last thing to show is on the FAQ HTML, which is where you're running this. Remember, this is the default behavior, no parameters. Or you can send in, well, you know what, on this page, I don't want it to start hidden. And if we refresh, now it's this way.
Okay. So you said, well, wait, I already have fact pages on my site. I haven't learned anything new today. Okay. Now we're going to show you a little bit more complex plugin, and then we'll fill the remainder of the time discussing some of these other tools that we've found helpful while engaged in these processes. So under other plugins, we had an expansion to our building that opened last September, and we wanted to go ahead and provide interactive wayfinding screens. So we bought several large touchscreen displays, built cabinets for them, mounted them on the wall. This is the software that we went ahead and wrote. And I wrote this as a plugin because we want to use this same functionality on several different displays for several different purposes within our site. So what you're seeing here isn't yet the plugin. This is the behavior that we have on our touch screens. So someone can come up, they can touch locations, and presents them with a list of buttons that they can click. If it's something outside of our building, it'll give them a message indicating it's something outside of our building and more information about where they can go to find that location. The plugin is extensible for this, but for our purposes, we didn't want to provide an entire campus map with this iteration of what we were doing. And you'll notice that because it's designed to be a kiosk that went back away after a certain period of timeout, we're not requiring the user to click things. And if I let this page go for a little while, it'll go all the way back to the main menu. On the other hand, if I click clinical externships, it'll switch over to the map, and it'll draw a red line showing the user from where they were, which kiosk they started at, how to get out to our externships program.
And the reason we could do this is we had existing maps in a software that could be exported to SVG.
Right. So we set those up. And then what I did is on each of the maps, I defined a start point, several start points. And the kiosk looks up its IP address and says, oh, for that fixed IP address, use this start point. The maps themselves are also interactive. If I pull up the map and I want to go to our library office, I can click just directly on the screen, and it'll show me the best routing. It'll route between floors. What I'm not showing here in this iteration of it is the ability to click an accessibility icon and have it not route you upstairs if you're in a wheelchair, which tends to not go well. The wheelchairs have a little trouble with the stairs, and we do try and be accommodating. So we're using this functionality right here for wayfinding. We're also going to use it on our donor information screen. So a donor can come up to their donor information screen, find themselves, and then get directions to any of the engraved plaques, named rooms, or other donor vending options throughout our law school, so that they can see and get a photo of themselves standing next to the plaque with their name on it. So this is just one example with one plugin. We've been doing a number of other development efforts for other projects that they've come in handy for.
Yeah, we're writing a calendaring system right now that's supposed to be good for multiple different departments on campus. Like law school is going to have our own calendar in here, but we'll allow it to expand for anyone else's calendar that they want. And they can come to the main server in order to see their calendar, or we wanted to do a jQuery plugin, so if they just wanted to include the calendar with kind of base functionality, no authentication, they could just call the jQuery plugin and it'll do the basic calendar. And how we do that is you pass data back and forth to our server from the client with JSON. And when you do that, jQuery has AJAX calls that are really make that really compact and handy. But the JSON, when it's a user is going to be getting the not the law school map, but say the Robert Mondavi Institute map from the Robert Mondavi server. They're going to go to that web page, and then their client is going to call our server. So there's a same origin policy built into browsers where it says, hey, you're getting some data from somewhere besides the server where this page is from. I don't like that, and it won't allow it. So there's a couple different ways to get around that. The one that we're using is called JSON-P, which is JSON with padding. It kind of you just wrap the JSON in a function call, so it makes it a script, and then it accesses it as a kind of just a script reference, which is you're allowed to get those from multiple servers.
What you see here, I took that plugin that I wrote and I made it available on Google Code, and this is showing a couple of the different initialization options that are available when you call that plugin. I'm defining it with 3 maps, defining the color, the width, the turn radius, and the speed of the path that gets drawn on the map. I'm showing the ability to have either a fixed start point or to have a start point that is returned by a function. And that function that I was using looks up the IP address of the screen that it's on and then returns the appropriate start point for it. So you can build in a lot of options with how you're handling things. The start point in this case is accepting either a function or a value. And the plugin handles both of those equally well. We showed you a little bit of JSLint. After you've got your code written and debugged, particularly if it's a large plugin, you may want to use a minifier. Really quickly, I'm going to go ahead and copy out what Ed has written here. And you'll notice down at the bottom that he has 1,736 characters. If we switch over and use a minifier, and I'm going to show you Google's Closure compiler, I can paste in all of the code that Ed wrote here, and I can set it for advanced minification, compile, and this is that same code in a much less readable format, but we've saved almost 64% of the transfer size for sending that to the client. Now, that's not a lot of savings for something this size, but when you get to something the size of the wayfinding plugin or one of the other plugins that we're developing, and you're getting a lot of hits, this can be an important factor to make things faster for your users.
Wayfinding's what, 1,000 lines?
And growing.
Yeah.
When we have some that are at 4,000 lines. So when you're taking something to production, using the section over here is much faster for your clients.
And Closure is great. There's also a slightly less great minifier that you can build into Notepad++ called JSMin.
Right. We demonstrated a little bit of the use of Notepad++ with some of the things. We didn't talk at all about unit testing. And it is possible to do unit testing with JavaScript. It is possible to do unit